Welcome to today's 2023 inaugural webinar series, Msha's 22 in Review and 2023 Forecast. We welcome you back to the series. Happy to be off and running again on it. As usual, your host today, Nick Scala. I'm chair of the National Msha Workplace Safety Practice Group here at Conn Maciel Carey. I work with mine operators and contractors all over the country dealing with Msha, from managing investigations or dealing with enforcement and litigation that follows with it, or working through compliance issues, whether that is a complex incident or fatality or abatement matter, or if it is liability or discrimination proceedings. Really, we're here to help you out in all your dealings with Msha, as well as OSHA and other labor and employment matters here at the firm. But today we're going to be focusing on what is going on with Msha, what we've seen from 2022, and what we expect in 2023, and then some areas of focus where we think that you should be looking to and paying attention to and considering what steps can or should we take at our facilities, whether that is just to retrain or to review and refresh our policies and procedures, along with what we're seeing coming out of the agency right now. It is a relatively young year on the calendar year side. We're not even through February yet. We have now seen, though, the kind of formation of Msha's top leadership, especially the political leadership, be cemented. That really happened in 2022. If you don't know yet, in April of 2022, Christopher Williamson was confirmed as the Assistant Secretary of Msha. Previously, we had an acting Assistant Secretary. We did not have a confirmed one through the Senate. That has changed. So Mr. Williamson is now the acting Secretary of Labor, has been since last April. In addition to that, that moved Jeanette Galanis from her role as acting Assistant Secretary to Deputy Assistant Secretary for Policy. She held the role while Mr. Williamson went through the confirmation process, and then stepped into a role as a deputy assistant. She is essentially a number two from the political leadership side. The constant on that Assistant Secretary's office is Ms. Patricia Sylvie. She has held the role as Deputy Assistant Secretary for Operations since 2010. If you have ever been on an Msha stakeholder call or been to many of the conferences where Msha leadership joins, you are aware of Ms. Sylvie. She is a force in Msha, and a consistent one at that. She has been there throughout the administrations in this role since 2010 and with the agency prior to that. So that is your senior leadership. A recent change at the administrative level for enforcement is that we have a new administrator of mine safety and health enforcement. Now, previously, this was a role divided up into two different positions: Administrator of Metal Non-Metal Safety and Health Enforcement, Administrator of Coal Mine Safety and Enforcement. Those were two separate roles. In the blurring that took place during the Trump administration, where there was a merger of metal, non-metal, and coal resources, as well as organization, those two roles were merged into one. So it is now the Administrator of Mine Safety and Health. That has now become, just in the last month, Brian Geffert. Brian Geffert has been with Msha for a long time. He was an inspector. He has worked his way up through different managerial roles, both in the national office and local level. He was, when the blur and the realignment occurred, we saw that the Administrator of Mine Safety and Health at that point was Tim Watkins. He served in Washington, and then Msha created regional administrators in Denver, Dallas, and Beckley, West Virginia. Brian was the Denver regional administrator at that time. Under the current administration, they have walked away from that regional administrator structure, with only really one remaining, and that's Dave Weaver in Dallas. But Brian is now back. He is the Administrator of Metal Mine Safety and Health Enforcement. Tim is going to serve as his deputy, as he has been for Nancy Rooney the last year or so. So, this is, I think, a positive development. Brian has held a number of roles. He has experience in the industry. The prior administrator is Nancy Rooney. She has now swapped positions with Brian and is the administrator of training and policy materials. But she did not have that enforcement experience previously. I think that's an important element for this role to have, because he has actually been out in mines. Now, he has some perspective of the operations side of things and how that affects safety and health. We'll see what Brian's role looks like as he continues to serve in that position and how he carves it out. But that is a relatively recent change at top leadership on enforcement. In terms of other leadership changes, news of late is that Secretary of Labor Marty Walsh has announced his resignation from the position. We do not have a replacement yet. Mr. Walsh has held that position for roughly 2 years. He is leaving to take a role as the head of the NHL Players Association. So that will open up to the Biden administration to put in both an acting Secretary of Labor in the interim, or wait and just continue to push through a new Secretary of Labor candidate. The two front runners right now appear to be Mr. Walsh's Deputy Secretary, Julie Sue, as well as former Rep. Sean Patrick Maloney from New York, who is getting championed by some of the Democratic caucus in the House. So we will see how that develops. Right now, it's just kind of a wait and see. It is notable, though, that Mr. Walsh is departing, and we are going to be getting a new Secretary of Labor partway through this administration. Now, I think, we always look at these statistics. There's limited amounts we can glean from them, but nonetheless, I think they are educational for us to see a historic perspective about where we are in the last year. A good thing that is nice is sometimes when we have this webinar, and we push it back usually for these statistics, but we're looking at we will be looking at 21 data right now. Msha has got their data updated pretty quickly. We are looking at 2022 data on the far right column of the chart up here. And this is a chart that we pulled directly from Msha's website. That is their Msha at a glance filings. And you can go in there if you want and poke around and select any number of NERs you want, and you can break it down by metal, non-metal, and or coal, which we'll do here on the next slide. But we can just see in the past 2.5 to 3 years, we have seen the number of mines remain slightly decline, but mainly stable. When we had 12,537 mines in 2022. The number of miners has actually increased to around 315,000. That's a good thing. 2022 started off pretty on a bad track with respect to the fatalities. Very quickly, we were off to a lot of fatalities. It looked like it could be a very bad year. Obviously, any fatalities is too many, and any fatality is a bad year. But the numbers really kind of curbed as the year went on. And we can see 2022 had a fair bit less fatalities in 2021. So that is a good thing. Additionally, our injury rate, we can see that decreased, which is not surprising given we had more miners and less fatalities. We look here, though, and I think one thing that jumps out to me right away is that we had an increase in the number of citations and orders issued. So that is, we always try to find out why that is. We'll see probably on the next slide a bit more information about where this jump comes from. But, when we have 78,000 citations issued in a year, and very close to almost the exact same number between 2020 and 2021, an 11,000 citation jump is significant. It's more than 10%. So that's, something that we'll be keeping an eye on. We usually see this with the coal industry, and I think the numbers on the next slide are probably going to bear that out for us. But that is signs of a more active Msha, and I think that this year is going to be a very active agency as well. So we can be prepared for that by looking at how we're having this jump right now. The second line or row from the bottom is the dollar assessments amount. That's in millions. So Msha last year assessed around $55.5 million in penalties, a jump from about 43 million the year before. So again, higher penalties. We know that we get a penalty increase each year because of inflation adjustment. That probably is more than the inflation adjustment it is. So it's something to pay attention to. We also saw an increase the last 2 years in the amount of tons, millions of tons of coal production. So coal is more active, which usually plays a part in the enforcement. And as we break that down, we can see that is what we bear out in the numbers. So this is the same data as that last chart, but I've broken it down, which you can do on the Msha website, into the metal, non-metal, and the coal data. So, when we look at metal, non-metal to kick it off, we can see that the number of mines actually decreased, but the number of miners increased in 2022 from 2021. The number of fatalities dropped down below 20. So that's a very good thing for the metal, non-metal industry to see, as well as the fatal injury rate and the all injury rates both fell the lowest in that 3-year span. So that is a very good thing to see for the industry that, despite, having the challenges of the pandemic still fresh, 22 saw a year where safety improved from the 2 prior for that side. The mining inspection areas, hours per mine, it still stayed the same throughout each. That's, I think, an interesting stat, but it just stays pretty stagnant. The citation orders, though, we were talking about on the last one, we had about an 11,000 citation and order increase from 2021. We can see that, just about 3,300 of those came from metal, non-metal. The rest were increases from coal enforcement. The metal, non-metal Sns rate is still below 20%, which is a pretty impressive mark that it's still that low. That's very good. The dollar amount increased up to 30 million and change from 24, a little less than 25 million. So I think, we can probably continue to expect to see citations increase in the number. I think the penalties are going to continue to increase in how high those are, because we're going to see a pretty significant jump and then inflation adjustment this year. But overall, these are pretty flat line on the grand scheme of things. So that's not surprising. Metal, non-metal is typically a pretty stable industry when we're looking at this data compared to what we see with coal. And I think that bears out here. On coal, we saw actually an increase of a handful of mines in 2022, as well as an increase in the number of miners. So that's very good. Their fatalities were the same as 2021, and a bit of a spike from 2020. Obviously that's not what we want to see, but their injury rate and their fatal rate were both decreased from the prior year. The citations and orders there increased, as we thought, a little more than 7,000. So that is more than, around 2/3 of the increase in that enforcement that we saw is coming from coal. I think that coal will continue to see that enforcement, just like we see with the metal, non-metal staying pretty stagnant. Coal ebbs and flows with how their production is going. We see production increasing, the number of mines have increased slightly, the number of miners has increased. I think we're going to continue to see enforcement in that area increase as well. Their SNS rate is climbing. It's now above 20% again. We'll see how that comes this year, but that is not surprising. Historically, SNS rates do not climb above or go below 20%. That was a pretty surprising statistic that we saw during the Trump administration, and it is working its way back up. I expect that 2023 will probably see both metal, non-metal, and coal be above that 20% threshold. This chart is just to look back to see the second year of the last three administrations. So 2014, the second year, full year of the Obama administration, 2018, the second year of the Trump administration, and then 2022, the second year of the Biden administration. And when we look at that, we can see, obviously there's been drop off in the number of mines and the number of miners. That is largely going to be attributable to a decline in the coal industry in that time frame. When we're looking at the fatalities, obviously we've seen very positive change from 2014 to 2018 and 2022 in the number of fatalities. Those are relatively flat, at least in this snapshot of the 3 years between 2018 and 2022. The fatal rate, injury rate is about flat between 2018 and 22, but 2014 it's down a good bit from there. So that's very good to see. The all injury rate has decreased in each one of these. So we are lower today than we were in 2014 and 2018. So that's very good to see. The number of citations issued, I think, is pretty stark in how it has declined from 121,000 in 2014 down to 88,000 in 2022. Now, 2014 was obviously the height of a very aggressive Msha administration and management, as well as coming off the heels of a number of different mine disasters in the early to mid 2000s. So, I think that was more of a outlier than a statement of the mining industry at the time. But nonetheless, we continue to see those numbers drop. Hopefully we don't see the numbers spike back up into around that 100,000 plus range, but it's something to keep an eye out. Likewise, we can see that the penalty assessed has decreased almost by half. And a lot of this, again, comes down to the number of coal mines being inspected, the number of coal mines receiving significant violations. So something to keep an eye on as we go, but just a historical look back at where this Msha is compared to the last few at a similar time. Now, we've talked a bit about fatalities, and unfortunately, we need to talk about them because it's important to review these in order to both, most importantly, reflect and protect the workforce and our mines and our miners, but also we need to look at this because these are the areas that Msha drills down on for their own initiatives. Now, we don't have rules to live by anymore, and rules to live by were essentially a breakdown of fatality data in the areas that where Msha found the most volatile conditions that they said were contributable to fatalities, right? Rules to live by are gone. They have not been brought back yet. We have not received a new list of rules to live by standards, but what we are seeing is that Msha is now starting to act a little bit more like OSHA with initiatives or emphasis programs. And these initiatives are going to be focused on areas where there are spikes in fatal injuries and severe accidents or serious injuries. So looking at 2021, we can see that the significant outlier there is powered haulage as the classification for the injury. So what was the cause of it? Msha found 17 of 37 were the result of powered haulage. Now, what happened after that? We saw a powered haulage initiative that Msha rolled out and has been championing and continues to enforce and work off of to this date. And we'll talk about that later as we go through it. The next highest number is down there at machinery. If you were on the Msha stakeholder call this past month, you would have heard the head of accident investigations, Mr. Marcus Smith, discuss that now we are seeing machinery as a spike in the occurrence. And they are going to be looking more closely at that. They're going to be looking more closely at the procedures and training that miners have, which is always the case, but especially with respect to working around machinery, lockout, tagouts, the installation and maintenance of guards and things of that nature. So when we're looking back at this, we can see that, 2021 had a total of 13 fatalities. 37. 13 of those were underground, 21 were on the surface, 3 were at facilities. Of that, though, 17 were powered haulage and 8 were machinery. That makes up 25 of 37. So clearly the areas that Msha is going to be looking at, and Msha did move forward with powered haulage. When we look at 2022, again, we're at a much lower number, but our main cause or our main classification has switched. It is now machinery, which is double powered haulage. If you were on the call, again, Msha was very pleased that powered haulage had decreased to the extent it had. Obviously, it's still too many, and that is what all of our mindset should be and is, but it has decreased significantly. So kudos to the industry on what you guys were doing there. Msha thinks that it's also because of their initiative and the effect that it has, and that is probably true as well, right? It's a partnership that we have in this respect. But you guys are on the ground daily. You guys are the ones implementing these changes and seeing them on a daily basis. So the industry should be applauded for that reduction. Now, what we did see is, though, machinery, which was at 8 the year before, is now at 10 and 22. We do not have a machinery initiative yet. I think it is very possible that we could get one if we see a continued pattern of machinery being an emphasis here. And again, when Msha is looking at this, they're looking very much at lockout tagout. Are you protecting from the controlling hazardous energy? Are you blocking things against motion, not only just at the source and the MCC room, but are you blocking something that can fall on the people working below it? Are you making sure that guards are replaced once they are put back or taken off for a repair? And are you instructing miners on all of this and training them and then documenting your training? During the meeting or the stakeholder call, Msha said that they are going to be focused on making employers develop and implement written, and they emphasize written numerous times, written policies, programs, or procedures for abatement purposes. Now, that we should be used to that in the event of a serious injury or fatality, but it is going to be something I think we see more in rank and file citations, especially with those are related to an accident, even if it might not be a very serious accident. We're going to see Msha pushing more and more on the abatement requirements. That's something that we have to keep an eye on because, right, unless it's an order, it's not shut down, we should be able to abate it. But if Msha is coming in and saying our abatement is not sufficient after the fact, we need to find out exactly why that is and exactly what they're looking for. And if Msha is not being reasonable with what they're requiring for abatement, that's the time when we need to consider, do we contest, do we challenge, how do we do that? Do we just have a informal discussion with our field office supervisor or management? All those are on the table, but we need to be sure that we're paying attention to that. So watch your abatement deadlines. I always say that, watch your abatement deadlines, make sure you're not letting abatements pass you, but also look at what the inspector is writing as abatement in there, if they put anything. And if they are not putting anything, and it looks like something where, it could cause question as to what will be accepted, talk to your inspector about it and try and make sure you're on the same page. Msha is not going to and cannot tell you specifically how to fix a problem, but they can say you need to make a document that outlines it and train to it. And I think we're going to see that again. We have always obviously been diligent and aware that task training is an area that Msha really focuses on, especially in the event of an accident or an injury. But I think that is going to be redoubled. So make sure that our task training is broken down, that we have specific task training for specific jobs and specific maintenance programs, and that we are training people to it and documenting that training so that we can answer the question when they say, where's the training on this? For 2023, unfortunately, we have had a very active first 2 months There have been 7 fatalities in the industry in 2023 so far. Of those, 3 have been electrical. And those 3 are going to be subject to a safety alert that we'll talk about next, but each one has to do with contacting power lines while in mobile equipment. The other ones are 1 each, and they are machinery, powered haulage, hand tools, and a slip and fall. Now, I made this chart because Msha it is not putting out that data in the same format yet for 2023, simply because they're still in the very initial phases of the investigation. So these accident classifications could change from Msha's opinion as we go forward, but this is just a breakdown of where we're at now. So, powered haulage is already there, machinery is already there, but the big one is going to be this electrical, which honestly, it goes in part with powered haulage, in my opinion. So let's take a look at the new safety alerts that we've seen this year. These safety alerts from Msha are published on their website. They are also sent out to Msha's subscription distribution list. If you are not subscribed to that list, I suggest that you do submit your email to it so that you can receive all those alerts that go out. You can limit the distributions that you receive, what you want to receive from Msha, but I would at least say that you want to receive anything related to safety alerts, because Msha's expectation is once these have been sent out to the industry and published to their website, you are on notice that it exists. And so if there are conditions at your mine that result in a serious injury or a fatality that were covered in the safety alert, you should have known about it. And you should have considered these recommendations and these best practices and implemented them to improve safety at your mine. Now, why is that important? It's because Msha can use it to increase the negligence of the citations that it issues. So be aware of these. If it's about a dredge and you don't have a dredge anywhere on your site, obviously you can review it, see if there's anything to glean from it, but you don't have to probably dig into it too far. But the first one we're going to look at right here is about high walls. If you have a high wall on your site, which most mines do, many mines do, you need to pay attention to this. Look at the best practices here, because these are also a glimpse into what Msha is going to expect from a enforcement perspective. And we know that Msha's citations, Msha's standards are vague enough that they can fit a lot of different conditions into a single standard that requires the inspection of high walls. So, pay attention to these. They're listed on Msha's website. We will post them as part of this, links to them as part of this presentation when we put it up on the blog for sharing, and also when it comes out to you guys. But the high wall safety alert, it was issued on January 23rd. The rationale for it, Msha cited back to 9 fatalities and 27 serious injuries from falling rocks and materials since 2012. They outline best practices for operators to consider and implement, which is develop and follow a plan for safe control of all high walls where mine walls work. There's more detail to each of these on the website. I didn't copy and paste all the text. It would have taken multiple slides, but you can dig into them a bit more there. Training miners, though, to recognize high wall hazards is going to be an essential element, as well as conducting high wall examinations. Those two go hand in hand, right? If we have someone who's conducting examinations, but they're not trained to recognize hazards, MSHA is not going to find them as an adequate person to perform that task. So we need to consider that when we're selecting who is going to be completing our high wall examinations. It also discussed never parking equipment or performing maintenance beneath high walls, using ditches or slope the ground so that the runoff drains away from high walls. Things that we can look at our high walls and evaluate whether or not that is the case. and then maybe make changes if we think they're necessary. But we just want to make sure that we can look back and we can say that we reviewed this, we know this, it's a good reminder. We might have all of these procedures in place, but it may be a time that we can look back and say, do we need to change these or improve these in any way? The second electrical safety or safety alert was for electrical safety. And this is the photo taken from Msha's safety alert. It was issued February 9th, following 3 fatalities in 10 days. In a double fatality on January 27th and another on February 6th, miners exited their haul trucks after they had struck power lines. And in each instance, the individuals were electrocuted and died. So you probably already know this. This has been well publicized in the MSHA world, but if you're not, take time and review MSHA's best practices. Consider having a safety stand down with your equipment operators or all of your employees, because it doesn't just apply to those who are operating a haul truck. And discuss, one, what happens when you are operating, avoiding overhead lines, and then also what to do if you contact a line. And MSHA has some best practices here. They have their guidance on what personnel should be doing, and you can take this and you can build off of it and create your own policy and create your own training to review with your employees. But these are 2 alerts that we have seen from MSHA this year. That is pretty quick to see 2 alerts in a year from MSHA. We expect that inspectors will be trying to review these with not only management, but the rank and file miners during their inspections. They will typically bring copies of these or want to sit down and review them and make sure that they even have a chance to sometimes talk with the workforce. That is something we do see. Oftentimes when we see, significant events where we're seeing a very strong pattern of the same hazard, we even see field office supervisors and management employees starting to make those visits. So this is something that I think MSHA is going to focus on a great deal. If you have an instance where a operator hits a line, even if there is not a fatality, but maybe there's a serious injury or MSHA gets wind of it, they're definitely going to be looking at your training. So make sure that your training for mobile equipment operators or operators of anyone that might come into contact with a line, be it a maintenance truck with a crane on it or something like that, that you have training on this documented, be it a toolbox talk or task training or something of the like, just so you can prove that you did cover it with them and that it has been addressed. Obviously we don't want to have any incidents happen, but when one does and we're getting scrutinized by MSHA, we want to be able to get credit for all the training we did. The only way we can do that is through documentation. With respect to kind of our next topic, I want to look at 1, powered haulage, and 2, the surface mobile equipment rulemaking. They go hand in hand in that surface mobile equipment rulemaking is somewhat based off of the powered haulage initiative, or at least a building block from it. So we last heard about the surface mobile equipment rulemaking quite a while ago, and the rule has been in review following the notice and comment rule period. So what do we know? It's not final yet. MSHA is still working on it. They have it listed in their fall agenda for 2023. On the stakeholder call, Pat Sylvie said that this was the goal for release, but it was fairly ambitious. So, I think right now what we're seeing is MSHA is very much focused on the Silica rulemaking. That rule we'll cover here in a bit, but has taken a lot of their bandwidth. I think they're going to be finishing the surface mobile equipment rule. I think it could be this year, maybe late this year, or early next. But they are working on it. So this is the rule that was going to apply to surface mobile equipment operation at surface mines, as well as the surface area of underground mines. If you recall, it was going to require operators with 6 or more miners to create a written plan, which would include training, maintenance procedures, as well as some other aspects that I think got pushed back on pretty hard. And my chief complaint with this rule was that it included a provision that the mine operator was responsible for identifying and evaluating the feasibility of new technologies for implementation at the mine. And, that gave many of us pause, because it seemed very much like a subjective case where Msha could come in at a later date and say, we deem this feasible, even though it might not have been technologically or financially feasible for the operation at the time. Someone might say, in the future, it was shifting to vehicles with radar around them so that you can notify when you're near a piece of equipment or a person. That is something that we're seeing more often in the industry, but installation of old equipment might not be financially feasible for all operations or technically feasible. Well, having to evaluate that and make that determination, it allows for, if an incident occurs, Msha to come in and say, your determination was not in rational basis. It was a feasible alternative. So I know that was one area, especially where industry pushed back quite hard on that rule. Whether or not that provision will remain when that final rule comes out, we'll see. When that final rule is released, much like the workplace exam rule, Msha is saying verbally that they will provide compliance assistance, compliance assistance resources, as well as time for operators to get in compliance before they start enforcing. But nonetheless, when the rule comes out in that final form, it will have an effective date on it. There will most likely be legal challenges to it. There always are, but operators need to start preparing at that time for the provisions included. We don't know what those are going to be yet, unfortunately. It's in the rulemaking process, so they're really not telling us what is changing, if anything, from the published or the proposed form. But the fact that it's taking less long, we should probably expect that some changes will be happening. However minor or major is, we do not know. The powered haulage initiative remains in place, and this is different than surface mobile equipment, right? A lot of times we hear that rule referred to as the powered haulage rule. They are similar and they cover some of the same areas, but are not the same. Where we see the main difference is that the powered haulage initiative continues to cover conveyor belt safety. Msha will look at mobile equipment operation, mobile equipment condition, ensuring that it's well maintained. Are your berms in place? Are your dump points of substantial construction? They're going to be paying attention to these issues. What is happening with seatbelt use? Is it being enforced? Are people trained to it? But the big one is where we see a departure between what's going to be covered in the surface mobile equipment rule is conveyor belt safety. That is very much part of the powered haulage rule. It is kind of one of those areas, like the safety alert on electrical safety that we saw earlier, which what I think was kind of a hybrid between powered haulage and electrical, because it had to do with the operation of mobile equipment striking power lines. Conveyor belt safety really comes between, in my opinion, machinery and powered haulage, because conveyor belts are both. And so, beware that Msha is going to be looking at the guarding with great scrutiny. They're going to be looking at lockout tagout procedures. They're going to be looking to make sure that the areas around conveyor belts when people are performing work are safe. That can be a safe access, as well as how do they get atop conveyor belts in order to perform the work, and where are they using the appropriate PPE, such as fall protection, in that process. There was the decrease, as we saw in 2022 from 2021, in attributed fatalities to powered haulage. So that's a very good thing, but I do not think Msha is going to let up. They see that as a victory, and as we all should. but we are going to continue to see pressure on the powered haulage front. And I think that's right now probably going to be focused on conveyor belt safety with the machinery injuries and fatalities increasing, as well as a continued focus on the operation of mobile equipment. Particularly, we're going to see a lot of pressure on operating near power lines for obvious reasons. So our last major topic for today is going to be Msha's respirable crystalline silica rulemaking, and then their safety initiative regarding the same. This rulemaking, we've heard about it for some time, haven't we? It's been a topic of discussion really in earnest since 2016, when we saw the OSHA rule become final. And the OSHA respirable crystalline silica rule notably moved the permissible exposure level down to 50 micrograms per meter cubed, created an action level at 25 milligrams per meter cubed. The action level triggers additional medical surveillance and obligations by the employer to complete sampling, as well as determine what sources may be existing for exposure and correcting those. The MSHA rule is still based off of the ACGIH threshold limit values from 1968. So it is very old reference. In 2016, we saw pressure for MSHA, or at least some momentum for MSHA to adopt, in large part, the OSHA rule. But that effort, which kind of was slow moving, was tabled, in my opinion, to push forward the workplace exam rule at the tail end of the Obama administration. So 2 administrations later, we're still working on getting a proposed rule. Well, where we're at with that is MSHA has drafted a proposed rule. This was sent to the White House Office of Management and Budget for review, as is the process, on January 18th. This review can take a couple months to several months to go. You know, it's intended to be completed within 60 to 90 days. Obviously, though, if they need to take more time, they will take more time. And at that point, it can be greenlit for MSHA to publish it in the Federal Register, which is really starts the public comment period, or OMB can tell MSHA to take it back and make changes to it. So we are not guaranteed a rule in the next 3 months. It is possible that we will see one, yes, but it is not guaranteed. Once the rule is published, though, in the Federal Register, all public stakeholders, whether companies or individuals or coalitions on the rulemaking or industry associations, will have the ability and the opportunity to review the language of the proposed rule and submit written comments on what they would like to see changed within. For the most part, they can offer support for it, they can offer their opinion that it is unnecessary, but what we really are going to want to do as an industry is pinpoint areas that we think are not necessary or applicable and push on having them removed. One thing that I know metal non-metal industry, the aggregate industry, has been pushing for some time in their discussions with MSHA is that there should be 2 rules here, one for coal mining and one for metal non-metal operations. We do not know if that's going to be the case. My guess is we will see a one-size-fits-all rule with a single permissible exposure level. We do not know if there's going to be an action level like we have with OSHA, but we will, see how that goes as we move forward. In addition to the rulemaking, though, which now we're just kind of more so to wait and see, but we have more expectation that it's coming than before, is their Silica Safety Initiative. This has been out for a year. It is going to continue into the foreseeable future for both coal and metal non-metal. They are conducting more frequent sampling across the country for silica and respirable dust. Msha is focusing on mines with past exceedances or known exposure sources. So specifically, if your mine is known to have, to Msha, to have a high source of silica exposure, you know, maybe it's what you mine, maybe it's that you crush it and dry it, or whatever the process that is used. The agency is aware that your mine is ripe for potential exposures, even if you haven't had one in many years or at all. Expect to continue to get tested regularly. In my opinion, you should be able to test yourself whenever Msha comes out. The only real way to challenge an Msha overexposure is if you have a contemporaneous reading or a companion sample, as we call them, that says at the same time this person wasn't overexposed. And you know, it does happen. I had a client just recently who ran a companion sample along with Msha's for a silica test, and the miner you know, managed to get a clump of sand down in their pump for the company, and the company sample came back over, but the Msha sample came back under. That could very easily be flipped. And if you don't have contemporaneous data, we can tell Msha until we're blue in the face that, you know, look at all this data that says, you know, here's 3 years of our testing where we haven't been over. They will rely on that sample saying they're over unless we can prove that there was something wrong with how the sample was taken, or it wasn't calibrated, or the pump was damaged, or it fell, or something along those lines. So if you're going to be an area, if you know that your mine has concerns with silica, prepare for that. Train someone how to conduct, you know, how to work the cyclone, how to calibrate it, how to read those results when they come in from the lab, and be prepared, you know, that when Msha shows up, if they're going to do this, that you want to try and get a pump on everyone that Msha does. It's, you know, Msha will let you do it. If the inspector doesn't want to let you do it, talk to their supervisor. They will let you do it. It is permissible. The Msha Pell is actually, so we were talking about OSHA's at 50 micrograms per meter cubed. Msha's is at 100, and that's really a threshold limit value, which is a term of art used by the American Council of Governmental Industrial Hygienists, or the ACGIH. But it's similar to a Pell, which is a permissible exposure level. The Msha math on how it's done is weighted by the percent respirable silica or quartz in the sample. So you can get a very high sample very quickly if you're dealing with very pure materials. So you know your operation, you know what materials you have, you know if you're going to have exposure sources. You should know that by now. If you don't, you need to try and find out. Start getting ahead of this, because it's not going to go away. We're going to have a rule here soon. This initiative is going to continue. If you have questions on how we can put together that kind of defense package with companion sampling, how that works, I'm happy to walk through it with you. The enforcement guidance states that Msha will conduct spot inspections. That's the word that they're calling it. Mines with repeated exposures may get inspected every 15 days. That's a pretty constant presence from Msha if we are failing to get our exposures under control. I know from a couple years ago, this is something that Msha talks about at a high senior management level on a weekly basis. They pay attention to every exposure for silica that's collected. So if you are having a number of exposures, it's not going to go by the wayside. Pay attention to that and make sure that we're acting appropriately. Msha is going to require abatement. That abatement is probably going to include things now, such as creating a corrective action plan. that outlines in writing what you're going to do to fix the issue, abate the issue. But, you know, if Msha comes back in their time frame and that abatement time frame and says they're going to do a sample and you are not under, they say now they are going to issue 104Bs. That means a removal of that process or shutdown of that area of the mine or that equipment until it is fixed. So this is a heavy tool that Msha is wielding now. 104Bs are one of, in my opinion, Msha's most powerful tools. In that, though, you got to stay on top of what's going on with your abatement. Are you reviewing what the abatement timeline is? Is it reasonable for you to evaluate where the exposure was, maybe what the source was, and then correct it? You need to look at this, but you also can't sit. If Msha is out there issuing a citation for Silica, you need to move quickly. In addition, another benefit of the companion sample is that Msha samples typically take 3-4 weeks to get back. They'll populate them on the website as soon as they do, and the inspectors usually give you a call or send you an email. If they have a citation to issue, they will probably come out and bring it to you. But you know, if we do our own companion samples, we can get those results back typically much quicker than Msha. So, you know, if we do come back and our sample's over and it's over by a wide margin, we can start our work to evaluate maybe what potential sources might be before Msha even gets there. In addition, at the Msha stakeholder call, and I just brought up the metal non-metal data here. I know that's what most of you are working in, so that is the most applicable here, but there's also these charts in the Msha stakeholder presentation for coal, but it talks about what are the most common areas of exposure, what were the most common for 2022 over the the TLV. These are the job duties that came in on the metal non-metal side. The most was a stone cutter, then crusher operator, bagger, utility and cleanup, and then miscellaneous and laborer. So in that, Msha identified some areas or best practices for improvement for each of these jobs. You can evaluate whether or not they're appropriate at your facility, but things that we can read that if we have an overexposure, Msha is going to be looking at this list as their kind of quick hitters on what we're going to be required for abatement. So, you know, if we have a crusher operator, do we have a properly designed wet spray system? Are we maintaining isolation enclosures and local exhaust vents? You know, those are things that Msha is going to look at immediately when they come out. Even if there isn't an overexposure, they're going to be looking at that. And if our wet spray system isn't working, you're probably going to get a question from Msha about why that is, and probably a citation for not having that in operation. Another area where we're seeing Msha focus is on equipment cabs. In this call as well, their head of health described that they are focusing on equipment cabs, the importance of operators maintaining them properly, and as a source control mechanism, that you need to be looking at the manufacturer guidelines for keeping them in good working order and cleaning them, putting in new filters, making sure that door seals or cracked windows are repaired promptly, and that the heat and AC are in good working order, because that is something that we often see a reason that leads to exposure, as this draws employees to open windows and doors. Additionally, if we're in an area like a drill operator or something who we know there is a risk of exposure, and they have a good cab that's in good working order with everything in line, we need to document training, and we need to enforce training that they cannot have doors and windows open. They should be able to sit in there if it's hot with the AC and be comfortable, because that is a very common source of exposure. It's that they are going to have the windows and doors open. As we talked about, in the event of a citation, we should expect Msha to require us to develop and implement a corrective action plan. This is likely going to require us to evaluate what the job duty is that was exposed, what the exposure source was, and how we are going to correct it and maintain it incorrectly. I have seen MSHA trying to now make these corrective action plans be beyond the scope of an overexposed position, that they are looking for the entire site. If you don't have the concern for exposure on the entire site or for all job duties, this can be tailored to where the exposure is, or at least the concern for exposure is. So, pay attention to that. Look at your deadlines, look at those abatement dates. You have to review this. If you need more time, you need to be proactive with MSHA. You need to explain what are the interim protective measures and be ready to discuss this that you have in place. It may be PPE, it may be, that you're doing additional testing in order to review it. But I will say, in this process, if you need more time, transparency is usually your friend. You don't need to tell them every thought that you have in your head, but if you are doing more testing, you can let them know that you're in the process of doing more testing for certain shifts, or to determine if it's a certain material that you're processing in a way, or the way it's being processed, or where that person is working. But do not go dark on MSHA and then they show up and you don't have anything done. That is going to result in a shutdown order, because that is what they're being taught to do there. So we are right up against the deadline, which brings me to some conclusions for my talk today. So we can be on the lookout for the surface mobile equipment rule in the next year, I think, probably either early 24 or in late 23. We are going to get a proposed rule for the respirable crystalline silica. When that comes out, we'll be sure to jump on here and do a special webinar to review it for you guys. And walk through that, and exactly what it's going to cover and how it might be impacting you. But we are going to have the opportunity to develop and submit comments. So that's something to watch out for if you are interested in doing that. A lot of organizations are going to do it. Here at CMC, we will probably be putting together a coalition to submit comments as well. Pay attention to your safety alerts, right? Those that apply to you, we have to review, we have to act on something similar and document it, so that we don't get in the position where if we have a similar accident, we can at least demonstrate that we took action when MSHA put out these alerts, right? We didn't just let them fall by the wayside. The same is true for the fatalgrams, right? If we see a fatalgram go out that is, akin to the operations we have on site, MSHA expects that we review the fatalgram and the best practices and see if we need to change anything we do at our site. And if nothing else, we should at least probably just review them at a toolbox talk and make a documentation that we reviewed our policies and the fatalgram or the safety alert at a toolbox talk, just so we can document and have record that we did look at those things. Pay attention to the continued initiatives. We are don't get lulled to sleep because they've now been in place for a couple years each. MSHA is certainly going to continue to pay attention to powered haulage. They are going to have more of an eye on machinery going forward in your lockout tagout policies, so make sure those are documented and appropriately so. If you're in California, make sure you understand your requirements with respect to lockout tagout, or just in general with Cal OSHA and MSHA, because you have dual jurisdiction there. And in the rest of the country, that's not really as much of a concern. You can focus on MSHA alone for the most part, but especially on lockout tagout, that's a lot of ones that I see from my California clients where, there's some confusion because you're expected to comply with Cal OSHA's lockout tagout, which reflects OSHA's, and that's much different than what we are required to do for MSHA. So make sure our programs are in place, make sure we're paying attention to what we have there. And then review your operations for potential silica exposure. If it's not a concern at your mind, good. You probably don't have to worry about it. You might want to just do a test or two to make sure that's the case, but the materials that you're mining, right? If they have silica within. If you are at site that is mining silica, dealing with silica, has a potential for silica overexposure, begin preparing, right? Start doing some proactive testing if you haven't already. Start preparing that MSHA will eventually get to the site to do it themselves. with that, I think we do have a couple questions, so we'll get to those here in a moment. But here's the rest of our webinars for the year. I hope you signed up for the rest of the series, or if you just want to sign up piecemeal, that's fine too. But thank you for joining us today. I'm glad to be back doing these and talking with you guys. We will keep you guys up to date, not only on the webinars, but on our blog, the Msha Defense Report. Additionally, these are some other blogs that the firm runs that are useful for your operations if you're regulated by OSHA or Cal OSHA, or for labor and employment matters too, if you're wearing the HR hat as well. So I will, I see I got one question in there, so I'll jump on that. So the question is, what are chances that Msha will develop or publish a table similar to OSHA's Table 1? So that's a great question. That's something that the industry has been pushing for. Msha has signaled over the past 5 years that they were open to it and trying to develop a table along with industry at some point. We haven't heard much on that lately. Now, that doesn't mean it's not going to happen, but we haven't heard anything that's going to be the case. And since the rule is at OMB, they're being tight-lipped about what it contains, because it's not in the form where it can be released at this time. So the big answer is we don't know. I don't think we can give you chances on it because Msha has been silent on the matter for quite some time. I know that it is something, though, that industry has pushed hard for, and I'm sure will continue to be pushed hard for in comments if it is not included in the rule. And if it is, revisions will, I'm sure, be pushed hard. For those who don't know, OSHA's Table 1 is included in the Silica, crystalline silica rule for construction. And it is a number of different tasks. And if you take specific actions, you are seen by OSHA to be meeting the compliance requirements. So that looks like the last of the questions. As always, I appreciate you all jumping on. If there's any questions that you didn't want to talk about in the chat here, my contact information is up on the screen. Please give me a call or shoot me an email. I'm always happy to chat with you and talk through any questions you might have. So thank you all. Have a good Friday. I appreciate you jumping on since we had to postpone this a couple of days this week, but thanks for your understanding, and we'll talk to you soon.